Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library. And I'm so excited to see you all tonight as we have this important conversation about being prepared for disasters as we see more and more coming down the pike. With me is Jenn Ball, the Assistant Town Manager of Ashland, and I will introduce her in a minute. I just want to let you know a couple things. One is that we are recording this session. We're also live streaming it on Facebook. So if you have questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. If you're on Facebook, you can put questions there, and I will let Jenn know that there are questions open for her. I also would like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library. They support all of our programming, and we could not do this kind of stuff without them. So we appreciate them a lot. So Jenn Ball is currently, and has been for 6 years, our Assistant Town Manager. But before that, I don't know if you knew this, but she was the Chief of Staff of MEMA, a Senior Policy Advisor at the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, and at some point, Director of Research and Development at the Lowell Police Department. I'm kind of hoping you weren't doing all of those at the same time.
No, 2 of them at the same time, but not.
Wow. Okay, well, you're my hero. So tonight we're here talking about how to be prepared for a disaster, what Ashland, the town of Ashland can do for you, and how you can be prepared to be safe for yourselves and your families. So I'm gonna start with a question for Jenn, and then she's gonna go into her presentation. Welcome, Jenn. Thank you so much for doing this. I know you're super busy.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I wanted to know, as a start, what are the most concerning things from your perspective of disasters or emergencies that we should be prepared for?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
What is the most important emergencies that we should be prepared for in the community? Like, everybody thinks that we should be prepared for a tornado, which happens like once in a decade. But what are the more immediate things that we should be aware of and prepared for?
So we're going to go into it a little bit more a bit later. So oftentimes, there's a bunch of hazards in the world of emergency management. Many of them have similar consequences. And so when you're really talking about emergency preparedness, you're also thinking about what the consequences are of those hazards. But, here in the Northeast, we often have snowstorms that can create long-term power outages. So those are sort of the things that happen annually that we need to sort of think about. We're certainly in an emergency of a pandemic, right? So we're having a public health emergency, and we have for the last 2 years. And so we've learned the importance of sort of being prepared and taking care of ourselves and our community. And so, I think when you start to think about emergencies, it really isn't one particular hazard. It's really, you're going to think about it more holistically. And so if you're prepared, generally, you are likely going to prepare for many different types of hazards. So I don't think it's any one thing that you have to sort of really concentrate on when you're talking about emergency preparedness.
Okay. I just wanted to say one thing to our attendees. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll be paying attention to those. But also, if you want to ask Jenn directly, just unmute yourself and I'll call on you, or you can use the raise hand function. So take it away, Jenn.
Thank you. So just for those of you who don't know, Mina sort of alluded to the fact that I was the Chief of Staff at MEMA, and at the same time, I was also the Senior Policy Advisor for Homeland Security for the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, which is basically the State Secretariat for Public Safety. I was there for a little over 5 years, and while I was there, MEMA helped in response to many different emergencies, many of which are natural disasters. We had snowstorms in which we had to activate the state EOC. The marathon bombing happened while I was there. And so sort of thinking about a response to that. Prior to the bombing, we always prepared for the marathon. MEMA was the head agency in terms of coordinating the state and local response for and preparation for the race as it moves through. And prior to the bombing, that was really focused on public health. Obviously you're worried about weather and public health emergencies for the runners. Post bombing, that was a lot different. We were much more worried sort of about public safety and security of the course for the runners, and obviously for the communities in which that goes through. We also spent an awful lot of time preparing for other large scale events. So we worked with the US Navy and as well as the Coast Guard on things like Sail Boston. So anytime that you have a group of people together in a public setting, we would sort of think about, what are the things that we would need if something happens. So there's in MEMA, there is a lot of the what if. So if this happened, what would we need to do? What should we be thinking about? What we're going to really talk about today, and I'll share my presentation, is really about what you guys should be thinking about. What does the public need to be thinking about as we talk about emergencies? And then also, what are some of the things that your local, state, and in some instances, your federal government would actually have in terms of resources? So I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping you guys will be able to see this. Just bear with me. Starting in the middle, but here we go. Okay. So the emergency management has a cycle. It's really a 4-phase cycle. It's mitigation, and really that is about public education, and then your state and local and federal authorities are really looking at the hazards in the community's vulnerabilities to those hazards. So they create plans. You'll see this a lot along the seacoast, right? You'll see communities starting to build up their homes and their infrastructure so that if there's any erosion or flooding, they're building that their community is strong and resilient to any sort of disaster, right? So that's in the mitigation area. And then preparedness, we're going to talk about this a bit in terms of personal preparedness, but communities, state and local first responders, public health officials, they are creating response plans. They review those plans regularly. They train on those plans and they exercise those plans, meaning, there'll be large scale exercises in which there is like pretend disasters, and they set out, it can happen on a tabletop. It can be real life with actors. And they're making sure that they are able to respond when and if an emergency happens. And then there's obviously response. So when something happens, your first responders are going to be on scene. They're going to try to stabilize the incident. Then they're going to sort of work to make sure that both personal and then also municipal property is preserved as much as it can be. This is where you're going to talk about evacuations and sheltering. Sometimes in really large scale events, like something like Hurricane Katrina, they were really talking about mass care, caring for hundreds of thousands of people at a time, and they're sheltering people because so many people are displaced. We're going to look on this in a real sort of micro level so that we can sort of talk about Ashland and maybe what we might need to think about in terms of emergencies. And the recovery is either short-term or long-term. So there can be real short-term recovery, in something like a snowstorm, right? You end up opening the streets, you find the hydrants, the recovery is reasonably short-term. It can be really long-term recovery for, something again, like the marathon bombing. There was some recovery in terms of, that street was shut down for, I believe, if I remember correctly, 12 days, it's reasonably short-term, right? And so they have to, but there's a huge economic impact to those businesses and to the city as a whole. But then there's longer term recovery as well. So again, something like a tropical storm in which you have real loss of property, you have a lot of damage. Some of the tornadoes that we see that happen in other parts of the country, that's real long term. They're talking about debris removal, huge schools and buildings are being, sort of knocked down. And there's a whole host of activities that happen for months and oftentimes years. And with that, there's also housing issues. And then lots of times there's social service and mental health services that have to go along with that. For tonight, we're really going to sort of think about this circle, and we're really going to just look at the top half of the circle, right? So a huge piece of mitigation is public education. And so really the focus on that is the more the public understands about emergency management and emergency preparedness, the more prepared you would be to sort of sustain yourself and your family for anywhere between 24 and 72 hours, right? So in a really big disaster, it may take first responders or others 24 to 72 hours to get to you. And that might be something as simple as you may not have your power for 3 days. And so what does that mean for you and your family? What should you be thinking about? We also saw in larger scale events, sometimes it takes, just to sort of find people who may be displaced in a huge flood, it takes a couple of days for people to sort of go house by house. So you really sort of need to think about your personal responsibility, right, for yourself and your family for that first 3 days. And that's really what we've always used as a guideline. And when I say prepare, what am I saying? And we sort of talked a little bit about this, right? But there's I sort of categorize them in 3 larger categories. Natural hazards, which we're going to think about as natural disasters, the stuff we see on the TV all the time, right? Hurricanes, winter storms, tornadoes, floods, fires, and other parts of the country. And again, I think to Mina's point, oftentimes here in the Northeast, you were looking at maybe flooding, right? So you could have you could have significant flooding. Winter storms are always an issue. It's just sort of like the magnitude of them. So when I was at MEMA, I think it was 2015 in January, the month of January, I believe we had the state EOC activated for 25 of the 31 days because of winter storms. There was just one storm after another and communities just couldn't keep up. So it was really hard to keep the roads open. It was really hard to make sure that the fire department could get to the hydrants. These are all sort of small things, but it requires lots of coordination amongst state and local officials to make sure that the residents are as safe as possible. Then there's man-made incidents, and some of this is intentional, like things like acts of terrorism or maybe a cyber attack, right? So somebody is intentionally trying to cause fear or harm to people or property. And then can be things that are accidental. So industrial accidents, this could be, something that happens where it's a plant, like something can happen at a plant where there is maybe contaminants released. And so you need to just think about something like that. Could be a train derailment. So things that are accidental, but have a large impact in a community. And then there's things that I'm calling emerging issues, and sort of these are the things that don't fit in the other 2 buckets, but right now, and oftentimes it's public health emergencies. So obviously COVID-19 is something that came out that we've been dealing with for the last 2 years. But while I was at MEMA, we were also concerned about, possible Ebola, the, triple E. These are the type of things that you're sort of thinking about. They're emerging issues that are, arguably natural, but like at the same time, very different than what you would consider a natural disaster, like what you would normally just sort of go to in your brain for that. Well, these are all very different, right? And so if you go to MEMA's website, which again is the Mass Emergency Management Agency. Do you have a question? No, okay. So if you went to the Massachusetts Emergency Management website, they have tips on how to handle every disaster that you can think of, pretty much. So what do you do in a hurricane? What are the things you need to worry about? What do you do before a tornado? What do you do during a tornado? What do you do after? So those type of tips, if you want to sort of dive in, is available. I'm not going to go into those because every single type of disaster or hazard has such a varying degree of what you might do. But many of these things have similar consequences. So oftentimes, you might have several days that you don't have power. So that can happen in a winter storm. If it can happen in a fire, it can happen in a high wind. That can happen with a cyber attack. So you want to think about those types of consequences as you prepare. Some of these things, state and local officials will ask you to stay at home or shelter in place, you might hear. That can happen again for a winter storm, like there's travel restrictions that also happened in Watertown while the local and state and federal police were looking for the suspect of the bombing, right? So residents were asked to just stay where they are. That's the safest thing to do right now. And so we'll talk about what you need to think about if that's asked of you. Sometimes though you're asked to evacuate. So things like hurricanes, you have several days notice. In particular, if you live on the coast, right, they're going to ask you potentially to evacuate the area because there may be high surge that's predicted, high winds. And so to to remove yourself from the area safely, you may be asked to evacuate. Similarly, you can usually predict a time of a flood. I mean, there's obviously flash flooding, and that's a bit different. But if it's a large flood because of the river, you can predict it. And so state and local officials may ask certain residents or certain neighborhoods or certain communities to safely evacuate. And so you want to think about, those type of things.
Jen,
So,
can I just interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Will you be talking about how we would hear about something like that?
I am, yeah.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So really, the way you would prepare for any one of these types of hazards is really 3 sort of basic steps, and we'll go into each of them. But you'll often hear emergency management professionals to say things like, make a plan, build a kit, and be informed. So sort of put in these 3 categories. And what does that actually really mean? So if you're creating a plan, you really want to think about if you heard that something was going to happen, where would you go? Right? How would you find your family? Because you may not be in the same place when you get information that something's happening. Oftentimes we say when you're building or creating your family emergency plan, you may want to think about where's a meetup in your home, where's a meetup outside of your neighborhood, so a little bit of a distance. So if it was actually something that was happening in your neighborhood that you weren't able to get home, where might you meet your family? Just so you guys can all make sure that you are safe. If you are asked to evacuate, where would you go? Do you have a place that you may be able to go to? Would you think about going to a hotel? And again, you need to really think about your family. And this is why it's sort of not a one size fits all, right? So if you have pets, you have to think about, how am I going to get my pet? Make sure that I can bring my pet wherever I'm going. Sometimes during a disaster, places like hotels will be a little bit more relaxed on their no pets policy. But again, if you're sort of thinking about, I might go to the Sheridan, right? You might want to call them and say, like, what would happen? Because they've thought these things through. They've been contacted usually by emergency management professionals that have sort of talked them through the importance of sort of having these types of flexibilities during a disaster, or perhaps they've lived through them. But you also want to make sure if you have children, and what are their needs, and so making sure that you're really considering everybody that's in your family. Do you have somebody in your family with a disability that you may need to make sure that they need assistance if they're asked to evacuate or go someplace? And again, sort of just making sure you have that sort of thought through. Obviously, these plans are sort of the best laid plans, right? Yeah, but you're not always able to sort of execute them all the way, but you have at least thought them through, so that if you have to change in the middle of your plan, you've at least thought some of that through. The other thing you want to really think about is that if you are asked to shelter in place, what does that mean? And so typically we suggest that you go into an interior room in your home, usually with the least amount of doors and the least amount of windows, right? So if you had, if there was a high wind event, that you don't want to have windows because the windows will shatter in. And so you want to have a space in which you don't have that that added hazard, but you also want to be in a place where you do have access to either a TV or a radio or a phone, because you do want to stay informed, right? You still want to be able to get information. You don't want to be in a place in which you can't get information, because oftentimes TV or radio is going to give you very direct direction. So for instance, during a tornado, watcher warning as it sort of comes closer, right? They would tell you, you want to get into the basement, you want to get into an interior room. And so they would tell you those things along the way. And so you wouldn't want to miss that if you were sheltering in place without that, right? And so, and you also want to make sure that you have provisions you would need. Again, you want to think about your pet. You don't know how long you may be there if you're sheltering in place from a longer term event. So again, if you go back to the families that were asked to shelter in place in Watertown while the police were doing it was a full day. So you want to make sure you have food and water, or access to food and water. And again, you want to be able to communicate with your families. It's important to sort of think about who you'd communicate with and how. Oftentimes during a disaster, you don't always, the typical cell, like sometimes it gets sort of blocked from so much activity. And so we found that oftentimes text messages will go through. So making sure, particularly maybe with seniors who are less likely or less comfortable with texting, I've made sure like I'm able to text message my grandmother in a way that she can actually get that information. She may not text me back, but she knows how to at least receive them. And so that if we needed to communicate with her, she would at least know that we were safe and that we'd be able to communicate. Usually it's sort of blocked up for a number of hours during an incident because everybody's trying to call their loved ones, right? Like when something hits, particularly a no notice event, they are, that really, everybody's calling all at the same time. And so you can't get through. And so people start to panic, but text messaging is really a really valuable tool, and just making sure that people have the proper numbers so that you can do that is really important. Does anyone have any questions about creating a plan?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay. And so again, this is all really sort of family specific. There are tons of resources online. Again, the MEMA, I can't say enough about the state website in terms of where they might have some questions just to sort of go down, and you can really kind of go down the rabbit hole. Like if you have anybody with a disability or any access, so if you had somebody in a wheelchair or you had somebody who needed medical attention, sort of giving you some resources about how to notify the first responders that you may need something like dialysis. There are state website and there's state databases that actually keep that information so that you get some priority treatment in terms of making sure that you're able to access those required in-home treatments if there is something like a power outage or your home isn't accessible. And so those things are really important just to sort of think about in terms of what's unique to your family. And there's a ton of resources on there. And again, the other thing is really sort of about pets and children, mostly pets, because I feel like oftentimes pets get left behind. It's amazing how often that happens. And so, we always had a saying in NEMA that if you're leaving, they go with you, right? Like you're going to take them with you. If you're being asked to evacuate, you go, they go. That's how it is. There are oftentimes animal shelters that will open their doors during emergency if you aren't able to take them wherever you're planning to go, that they'll keep them temporarily safe and so that they're not stuck in a possible hazard. But often in some disasters, you're not able to go right back to your home. And so, you never want to leave your pet behind and then have to go back to a potentially dangerous situation to retrieve them. So that's sort of the creating a plan. And then the second step, and again, these sort of can happen in parallel. You certainly don't have to, it's not a 1, 2, 3. These are just the big buckets, is build a kit. You can do this as a family and it can sort of be fun. While I was at NEMA, actually my coworker was a guest on Arthur on PBS, and they talked about the importance of building a kit with children. So it can be a little bit of a fun activity. You can put it in one of those tubs so you can take it, or if you were sheltering in place in a sort of interior room, you could take this tub and you have most of the provisions you would need. And in that kit, you really want to think about what would your family need for 24 to 72 hours, right? So it would be water, non-perishable foods, flashlights and batteries. So you don't want to have necessarily using candles, right? Like you don't want to leave that on for a light source because you would move probably room from room if you're in your home for a power outage. And so you want to make sure you have batteries. Super important in today's day and age is a cell phone charger. Or maybe even a solar backup that has a battery charger that you're able to connect your cell phone in, because I feel like all of us are so reliant on our cell phones, not only just to communicate with one another, but that's how we get our news. That's how we're going to get emergency alerts. That's how we're going to follow people on social media. That's how we're going to make sure our loved ones are safe. And so I think, that tends to be the most important item for people, just to sort of make sure that they're feeling safe and that they're able to communicate. You'd also want to put in tools, personal items. And so personal items are really sort of, you might want soaps, or you might want prescription medicine. One thing that people don't often think about are copies of important documents. You would probably want to put a copy of your insurance, your home insurance, just in case there is damage, right? And you can't get to it. You may want copies of your license and passports. And again, they're not replacements necessarily for the real thing, but they certainly give you a starting point if you weren't able to recover those things. And then a small amount of cash. And so I think in today's world, like, nobody carries cash ever, including me. I never have cash. But having a kit that has some cash in it is really smart, because if there is a significant event, there is a chance that you will not have access to an ATM, or the ATM might be down, or the credit card systems could be down, or maybe the grocery store can't actually take credit cards because of a power outage or some other issue. So having a small amount of cash gives you a lot of flexibility. And if you need to get provisions of any sort. And so it's something that for me is hard to think about, because I don't ever have it on me. And so to sort of put that in a kit and make sure that we have it if necessary. And it's really important to sort of check. So there's some checklists, which this is linked to on MEMA's website, that talks about sort of more in detail what you might want to put in a kit. These are sort of just a visual aid. The other thing that's important that we'd often talk about is just making sure you're checking the dates on the batteries on your food, right? And so it's often hard if you build this along the way. And again, you don't have to do this all at once. So you can start to think about, I'm going to get 1 or 2 items this week at the grocery store. I'm going to get an extra gallon of water, because if you're really trying to prepare your family for 72 hours, you have to think about 1 gallon of water per day per person. So it's a lot of water, right? And if you start to really think about the other things you may need, it could get expensive if you're not already having some of this on hand. And so if you think about it, starting tomorrow, when you go to the grocery store this week, maybe you pick up 1 extra item, or maybe you pick up an extra pack of batteries. So you could start to build it up over a couple of months. But then you want to go back. Probably the way we've done it is you really sort of look at it when you turn the clocks back for daylight savings or forward. So twice a year, just sort of look through your kit, make sure that there isn't anything that needs to come out. This again is important for things like food, batteries, perhaps some prescriptions. If you have prescription medication in there, you obviously wouldn't, that something maybe in your first aid kit that might have expired. You want to make sure all of that's up to date, because if you go to use it and it's out of date, sort of you've prepared, but then you're not really ready, right? The other place in which we sort of talk about having a kit is your car. So again, if we're really talking about things that impact us in the Northeast, oftentimes it's winter weather, and you can easily get stuck in your car. I think it says something like 70% of winter deaths are related to snow and ice occur in cars, that are related to snow and ice occur in cars. So there's just a higher chance of you being stuck in your car during winter weather. And so thinking about you may have a family emergency kit at your house, but you're likely not bringing that every time you go to work, right? Or like go wherever you're going to go. And so having a smaller, a more focused kit in your car at all times can be helpful. And you'd put things in, again, the phone charger is always important, and a flashlight, and maybe some small tools, first aid kit, shovel, things like that, where warmer clothes again. So if you were stuck, you would be able to keep warm until help arrived. That's always something that you may want to think about as an additional preparedness measure. Any questions on kit building.
I had a question about that. Are they
Sure.
the lists are just things that on MEMA's website that you can they recommend that you have. It's not like actual kits.
No, it's not actual kits, right? So yeah, you can build your own. There are plenty of companies out there that if you typed in Google personal emergency kit, there are kits that you can purchase and then obviously add to if you wanted to personalize that. There isn't, there's, you can, I think probably Amazon has them, right? So you can do that if what you wanted was a starting point. I would still suggest sort of making sure you look at the more comprehensive list from MEMA. And I think I can click on this and just show you all. Sure. Yeah. So this is obviously suggested, right? And so, this is where I was talking, you get a little daunting if you were trying to do it tomorrow, right? Like start to build all of this. I should sort of say, they do always recommend a radio, and that's partly because you can be battery operated. So if you don't have a TV and you lose your cell phone, it can be battery operated. And they actually have these ones that are hand cranked. And so you could just get emergency information that way. And they often recommend that. But, this could be a bit daunting. So, and again, then there's some comfort items, right? So if you do have children, you might, if the power is out and you don't want them to drive you totally crazy, you may think about games or books or puzzles that would keep them busy while you're handling the emergency. And then you usually want to have clothing for both, both seasons, like warm clothes and also clothes for warm weather. And then depending on the season, you may want to have sort of like insect repellent, etc. Yeah, so this is just really just a suggestion. And again, if you started with a purchase kit, you could always go in and add things that are really personal to your family. See if I can. So the other, so I think, Mina, you had a question sort of about how do you get information and how do you stay informed? Because obviously that's incredibly important in an emergency, is sort of having really reliable, factual information. So, I would not recommend getting emergency information from social media, in terms of like people will post all sorts of things during an emergency. And I think while you can get some sort of sourced information that way, you want to make sure if you're trying to act on information, you're getting it from reliable source. So the federal government has the emergency alerting system, which many of you probably have heard, that sound that comes over your radio or your TV, and that's really just to make sure the system is working. That can be used for Amber Alerts, major weather alerts, presidential alerts. And they've expanded that to a wireless alerting system. And so you maybe have had your cell phone sort of have an alert that you didn't know you were going to get. Could be a tornado warning or something that comes over quickly on your phone, and that's pushed again through the federal system. And the National Weather Service can push those. Sometimes we get them for Amber Alerts, and so you'll get a message all of a sudden on your cell phone that says, missing child. And so the federal government has that capacity, and they can sort of push that down to state agencies that can push some information out under certain criteria, but that's a pretty high level in terms of the type of information that they're going to push out. And the national weather will be very local, but again, it's going to be that sort of high threshold of information. And while I said, like, don't get your information necessarily from social media, I think it is important to sort of follow our public safety agencies. So both of our police and fire have their own social media. The Town of Ashland has their own social media presence. The state through the Emergency Management Agency and also the Department of Public Health all have their own. And so following that, they will also get very timely factual information. You will also get information from the news, obviously. And here we're going to talk a little bit more, but here in Ashland for emergency alerts, if you're not signed up for Code Red, it's certainly something we should walk you through. It's really important. That is where we would push any sort of very time sensitive emergency information out to, because we're able to push that out to the entire town, assuming that you have signed up. We can do it just for neighborhoods. We can actually go down to a phone number. Brigitte Gupta is on tonight, and he's our public health director, and we're actually trying to use Code Red to help expedite some of the contact tracing for COVID-19 as we're sort of moving through. So we were able to give a message to, one individual through this system. So it can be really scaled. It's really great. We use it for both emergency as well as non-emergency information as well. And then the state also has, it's called 211. So basically you could dial 211 and ask any non-emergency question about an emergency at any time. And so they're there to answer all sorts of questions. They can answer questions about, open shelters. They can answer questions about, so if the governor says there's a big storm coming and we're not able to drive from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., you can call and ask questions about exemptions. What's that mean? What if I have to leave? They're able to walk you through that. And then post disaster, they're able to help you sort of navigate possible recovery systems so that they can help you through that. So 211 is there. It's sort of the partner to 911. So obviously if you have a real emergency and you need help from police or fire, they're always there. You dial 911, they're going to come, right? 211 is really for non-emergency. It's basically a hotline that can help navigate all the systems and walk you through that. We also tend to set up hotlines. So like right now we have a COVID-19 hotline. And so if you have a question about COVID-19 or something that's been pushed out in terms of a policy, a question about vaccination clinics or anything like that, you can call that number and we'll provide assistance for that. And we've stood that up for other things as well. And those sort of are just sort of short-term hotlines, and then they tend to go away after that disaster or emergency subsides. So I'm going to walk people through, if you don't mind, what Code Red is and sort of where it can be found. So there's a couple of things that I think have inhibited people to sign up. So if you went to the Ashland Police Department's website, it's on the homepage. It says Code Red. You just click on that. When you go there, it looks like you need to sign up, create an account, which I think can be like, I don't know, maybe makes people feel less likely to sign up. You do not need to do that. You can just put your information in. Some people don't like the general information, so we often sort of push out Code Reds if their trash day is going to be switched. That we may put out a Code Red about school information. And so you can opt out. I mean, once you opt out, you won't receive any of those notifications, and you'd only receive emergency notifications. I personally stay opt-in because I feel like we don't use it that often that you would be getting calls, once a week even. And so I feel like you get really good information from the town, from the schools, from the police department through that tool. And so if you just clicked on, you just click on it, and you would just, so here is what I was talking about. It says, or created an account, and you can just say, no, I'll enroll as a guest and continue. And then you just fill out your name and your contact information. And so you'd be able to receive a text message, a call to your home. They can leave a voicemail, and that way you would have that information even if you weren't at home. So even if you were at work and we pushed out a Code Red, they may call your home, but they could also call your personal cell phone, and they can call other cell phones in your home, and so that everybody is receiving the information. And typically when we push those messages out, it is informational in terms of something is happening, and then usually followed up with what we hope you're going to do. And so, for an example, if we had an event that we needed people to stay at home, the event would say, X happened at whatever time it happened. we're asking residents of Ashland to stay, shelter in place for the next 10 hours. And then we would be able to communicate a little bit more often so that we'd be able to provide updates so that people would know what to do in those events. Does anyone have any questions about that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Let's see. Is there any advantage to creating an account on the Code Red? Does it give you more services of some sort, or?
I don't think it does. So I have an account, but it's because I have Code Red in Ashland and then also where I live. And so it allows you to have more, I can opt into 2 different towns.
That's good. Okay. And I'm kind of curious because I do get some sorts of notifications on my 881 number already, and I don't know if I'm getting Code Red, but if this would help me get them on my cell phone, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So I think that Matthew has a similar question. He says he receives some phone calls from the town. Does that mean he's opted in?
Yes, so likely if you're receiving them at home, you've opted in at some point. I believe that you can add additional information if you'd like to also receive it on your cell phone, right?
Okay.
May I ask another question?
Sure.
Is it possible then, if we've already been opted in somehow, that when we go on that website, on the police website, that we might need to find our account? It might already be there, or not account, but find that our information's already there?
I don't. So if you created an account previously, you could certainly log in and change any of your information. So, you could log in and then you change, if you had a different cell phone number, you're able to do that. I think that if you continued as a guest and it would be a duplication, I think we would be able to see that it would just be an add-on. I can certainly look into that.
Okay.
And we can certainly post an additional follow-up to that, just to sort of see if somebody is receiving them at their home but not on their cell phone. If they wanted to update that, do they need to do it? Can they do it just through this system, or do they need to find their actual account? I can look into that, and maybe we can put that out to the group after, as I can follow up and just to make sure I'm giving the correct information.
Yep, I actually already said that I would be sending out a recap with your slides, so I can add that too.
Okay, and I can follow up in the morning and find out about that.
Perfect. I'm not seeing any other questions right now.
Okay, let me. So the other thing, let me just go back one more thing. So one of the things when you're starting to hear, and this happens an awful lot, and I want to make sure I'm going to get it right. So it happens an awful lot when you hear about a natural occurrence, right? So on the news, so we talk about, and Mina, you asked earlier, like people are super worried about tornadoes, and you hear the difference, like we're in a tornado watch, and we're in a tornado warning, or we're in a thunderstorm watch or a warning. And so what's the difference? Because it's really important in terms of what you might do to protect yourself and your family. So a watch really is that the atmosphere is good, for the lack of a better word. It's sort of primed for that type of weather, but that it's not already occurring. Like we're not already seeing thunder showers or lightning or swirling of clouds, but that the atmosphere is primed for that. So it could happen. So basically, so to stay alert, make sure you keep listening, but this is where really just sort of watching what's happening, but you don't necessarily have to take any protective measures right now. A warning means that it's either occurring right now or it's imminent. And so you should take protective measures. So if somebody says you're in a flash flooding warning, it means you need to sort of think about where you are. You would want to be on higher ground, those type of things. If it's a tornado warning, that's when you may hear the weather person say, if you're in Ashland, you might want to move down into your basement, right? So that's because you're in a warning area now, and those are usually shrunken down. Watches are pretty large swaths because it could happen in lots of places, but warnings, they tend to sort of like narrow in a bit more. So that's just important. I feel like we hear those words an awful lot, and it can also mean sort of whether you're taking action right now or you're just sort of being alert. And so that's important as you sort of listen to your weather predictions or any weather information that you may be getting. I did want to sort of talk a little bit, I spent a lot of time talking about sort of the need to be prepared for you and your family for the first 24 to 72 hours. But I did want to spend a little time at least on, what types of resources and help can local and state governments have. Obviously, your police and fire are going to respond to events 365 days a year, all day, 24/7. So if you have an emergency, you call them. If an event's going to happen, they're going to be responding to multiple 911 calls. They're going to try to be figuring out what's happening, what needs, how can they get in more services and more help to make sure that the residents are safe. For instance, in larger fires, our fire department often is coordinating with the Red Cross. So Red Cross will actually come out to events to make sure that residents have what they need, and whether they're displaced, to make sure that they have someplace to go during that initial, if it happens overnight, that they have a place to stay. We're really lucky in Ashland where we have the emergency fund. And so if somebody does not have a place to go or they can't afford a hotel, we do have access at all times of the day in terms of, accessing some small amount from the emergency fund to help families make sure that they have a safe and secure place if they are displaced by a fire or another natural event. And so we've often used that, and we have it set up where the fire department is able to directly coordinate with the emergency fund on scene. And so they're not actually leaving the scene until they make sure that if they need to help with accommodations, they're able to do that. And if necessary, we also have a human services department that can come in either sort of the time of the event, or they can do a follow-up the very next day. So if a family is displaced from a fire, our human services, we have a full-time social worker and a part-time clinician. They would do some follow-up to make sure, do you need clothes? Do you need food? Do you need help sort of navigating the system? How do we make sure that your family is safe and working through recovery? And we've definitely had some incidences of that. For other events that might be planned, we'd have access through our emergency management director, who in our town is our fire chief, Chief Roby. And so it would be in constant communication with the state. So in larger events, they're going to activate the state EOC. And basically the state EOC, which is the Emergency Operations Center, brings all of the state departments. So you'd have Department of Public Health, the Public Utilities, you'd have Coast Guard, you would have a variety of communications professionals that would be there, that you can access resources and assistance from the state right through the state EOC. And so if we needed help with anything, we would do a request and they would help with that. And so when I was at MEMA, oftentimes you'd have a community that might have an issue with water, right? And so they would actually work with the large sort of bigger box stores and try to get big supplies of water, and they could help with water distribution. Again, this happens a lot in sort of high heat index weeks. And so you want to make sure that your community is well hydrated, and maybe there's some issues there. And so you can help and request that kind of help. And so that can happen through our emergency management director. And then on a really sort of local level, we've also had some opportunities to host recovery centers right here at our community center. So our community center houses our human services department. And so Jennifer Wolfing, who is our social worker, we had a large fire at one of our apartment buildings, and it displaced many, many families, and they were in various states of need. And so what we held was a recovery resource center, right? So we held it for one day. We had our emergency fund, who was really a great partner and was able to help our families sort of recover quickly from that. We had the Red Cross and some state agencies that provide financial assistance and housing assistance, as well as we had our food pantry, and we had a ton of donations from the community in terms of, clothing and bedding and things that families may need quickly. And so we were able to hold that, and the victims of the fires could come in and just have sort of one-stop shopping where they were able to sort of walk around and get the information they needed to sort of help move them and their families closer to recovery. I mean, I think that model was a really great model in terms of trying to help people who are in real need and post-trauma. It's like really traumatic after that happens, to sort of make it as easy as possible to get them the resources. And while we don't necessarily have all those resources locally, we're able to help connect those dots. The other thing is, so we have technically our shelter is at the high school, at least to my knowledge, we've never necessarily used the shelter. So the shelter is required to have all sorts of amenities, meaning they need to have a place for mass feeding. You need to have a place in which you can have cots safely so people can sleep. You need to have washroom areas like locker rooms. And so oftentimes they're schools. At least in my memory and the research I've done, we've never used the shelter, but we have in a incident where we had no power. And it was a very cold night. We did use the community center and stand that up as a warming shelter and a charging again. So, they had power. We were able to have the heat. We were able to have, if people did not have heat and they were cold, if they needed a spot to charge their cell phone, they were able to come into the community center, get warm, maybe have a cup of coffee, maybe hang out and sort of just take a minute. Also, they could take, we had areas in which we were, if you had your charger, you could use that and charge your phone. So again, you could communicate with your family. And so those are the types of things at a very local level that we could do. And then also we could certainly help navigate some of the state systems because—
Jen,
Yep.
a quick question. So the community center, was it operated at that occasion? Did it have power or was it off generators?
No, it had power. It had power then. Yeah. So it was a localized power outage. We have been working to make sure that we have generator power at some of these buildings so that we would be able to utilize these types of spaces, even if the entire town was out of power.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And certainly at a local level, we can help sort of navigate. There always are, if there is a large enough disaster, the president would have a declaration of a disaster, and that opens up some federal programs. Most of those programs are sort of geared towards local and state entities in terms of building, again, when I was talking about removal of debris, cleanup, those type of things. But there are some personal individual assistance called individual assistance. And so that has to meet all sorts of criteria, may cover some of your lost damages that are not covered by insurance. And so we talked about preparing. One thing you really want to do post-disaster, after something's happened, is make sure you take pictures of anything that might be damaged. And that way, as you work through that insurance process, or maybe you have access to an individual assistance program, you have the photo documentation of what occurred so that you can make a case on what you can potentially be reimbursed for in terms of those losses.
Jen, we have a question from Nita who asks, if you're in a shelter and you're being provided food, do we locally have the ability to provide for folks with food allergies or people that have some other health conditions or special diets or needs?
So when you arrive at a shelter, so you would be able to sort of communicate. There's typically a shelter manager. So when you arrive there, you'd be able to communicate with the shelter manager about some of your needs. At a local level, we'd certainly try to accommodate any of those things that we can. Again, we've never sort of stood up the shelter here where we'd actually, were making sure we were feeding, feeding or having people stay more than a few hours at a warming shelter, right? And so, but certainly at the state level, they are planning for all of those type of things. So people who have food allergies or dietary needs, or they have access or disabilities and they might not be able to get to a shelter, all of those things are worked into a larger mass care and sheltering plan. Because again, if we had a very large scale, we would probably be using regional shelters. And then really at a local level, you're really talking about making sure you have safe transportation to those larger shelters, which would have those capabilities.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, one more. Like it was state considering the possibility that cell connection can be down partially, because like as long as cell phones are working, I think messages will go. But what would be the chances of
cell phone, like having no cell phone access?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, certainly I think in a no notice event, so something like the marathon bombing, right? So that happened.
Yeah.
And nobody was necessarily prepared for that. Everybody on that area got on their phones, just like their people, their loved ones, their runners, all of that. So there was a period of time in which cell phones were not working. That being said, what we did find during that event is that text messages did go through. So people were communicating via text message. So you can sign up for, so there's certainly thinking about, do you push it both as a phone message through the cell phone, but also like what's our capabilities in terms of like texting out that kind of information. And it's certainly something that at the state and at the federal level, sort of thinking that through, because obviously a larger scale disaster, you're going to have more and more people using that cell. And so the bandwidth will obviously, collapse. And so there may be some lag time in terms of pushing out those notifications, but that's also why you have the federal emergency alerting, which would go over your radio and your telephone, and your TV. So again, it's not, we carry the cell phones around and they're sort of our lifeline, but some of the older technology in terms of like radios and TVs may actually sort of prove themselves beneficial in that type of an event.
Mhm.
I know a guy who has a very tall ham radio tower.
Yes. Yes.
We'll all walk there if things are really
right, because those type, and that type of communication has goes on a different frequency, right? So like the public safety radio to radio communication is obviously different and a different frequency than our cell phones. So it's less impacted.
A private, it's basically visibility or tower visibility, and it's like a private. I'm not joking that I know where the guy lives because that's a private sort of. Some people who are enthusiasts, and worse comes to worse,
Right.
they able to communicate via the radio.
Yep. So Matthew asks, where are those regional shelters around us?
So there's so it really depends on what event it is, and so they would communicate that out, right? And so that's the type of thing that they've been working on at a state level. And so when I left MEMA, they were working on sort of identifying those places that they could have the regional shelters. So it could be something like I know they hadn't solidified with sort of contracts when I was there, but they were looking at community colleges perhaps, or universities, because they have the necessary feeding and sleeping facilities. My guess is that some of the regional sheltering planning probably has been put on hold, just given the amount of response effort it has probably taken for how to respond to COVID-19. And so, I left there 6 years ago. My guess is that they're still working through identifying the right regional locations. If we needed to use it tomorrow, I think that they would be able to stand that up, but they would just have to communicate with the locals. Again, this is where you're going to have the lag time for trying to figure out what's going on in an incident to how to respond, right? So you may have a lag time of some number of days while we figure out transportation and how to get people to those regional shelters. But those are the types of things that are continuously evolving at a state level typically, and then also given some guidance from the federal government.
So we have a question about, are there any other things to share information? You had said the radio. Is there anything that doesn't involve technology that people could use?
So, I mean, in terms of sharing information, so it's usually real time. So you're not going to be able to sort of like post out notifications. So most of it is sort of more technologically based. I mean, again, you can have the crank hand radio. You can have a NOAA radio, which is basically, it's a weather radio. It's you know, just a standalone, and it really just gives you alerts about weather. But oftentimes if we're trying to communicate real-time information, it would really use, you know, sort of media outlets in order to try to get as many people as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and if you're close to, so, I mean, we did have some nuclear plants that, or, you know, our communities are in sort of that evacuation area. They use sirens. And so they have sirens that sort of, if they practice those often. Obviously, like in other areas that do have, often have tornadoes, they will use sirens. It's not something in Massachusetts, unless you're really talking about sort of that nuclear energy evacuation zone, that would be used for other hazards.
And is there a specific radio station that people should tune into in case of an emergency?
Yeah, so for like the emergency alerts, those get pushed to all of the stations. Like that's why they beep on almost every TV station when they're doing the tests, or you'll hear it on whatever station you might listen to. So those get pushed to all of the, and it should get pushed to, I think, almost all of the cellular carriers as well.
Okay. We're just about out of time. If anybody has any last questions or thoughts, I did want to ask, you said that we will be, you know, most likely unable to get services for 24 to 72 hours. Is there something that we should be doing in terms of not just ourselves, but like just the people around us, our neighbors, to make sure that we're all safe?
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, oftentimes you'll hear people say, like, just check on your neighbors, right? Again, along like long-term power outages. I don't know if you guys remember, I think it was, you know, the Fitchburg area, they were out of power for like 10 days or something around in December. I think it was like 2014. So just making sure you're checking on your neighbors, you know, checking in particular if you have neighbors who may be seniors, or you may have somebody that has a disability that may not be able to get out and get the provisions as easily as you. So just checking on your neighbors, making sure that they have the information. Maybe they might need a provision. You know, again, you can always request assistance also. So just as an example, in Watertown, you saw those pictures of the National Guard going around giving out milk because people were not necessarily prepared to stay in their homes for 12 hours. And some people had infants that needed milk. And so, you know, there's definitely, you know, you can certainly ask for assistance. It's just when you're thinking about emergency preparedness, you want to think about those first 3 days, what you might need. And then also, you know, it is smart always to check on your neighbors.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I don't see any more questions, and I received the census, and I'm wondering if that, Elizabeth, we sort of lost the last part of your question there. But we are about out of time, so I did want to say thank you, Jen, for this really you know, helpful information for us in case of any emergencies. Elizabeth, this question did come out about, I'm wondering if that information is used to figure out how many people to look for in an emergency. That's a really good question, using the census.
Yeah, so probably the number, you know, so that number, oftentimes I think when people, if people are missing or not accounted for, oftentimes it's getting reports from loved ones or neighbors, so oftentimes, the census is just a number, right? So but you get a lot of information if people are missing after a disaster on how to, who they're looking for, or, where they were last seen, or those type of things. And so again, that takes some time in terms of like making those connections, but oftentimes you'll get that from people who are trying to find their loved ones.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And again, thank you, Jen. This is really helpful. And thank you everybody for being here and your really smart questions. And we will be, like I said, I'll be sending out a recap with Jen's slides and some additional information that she's going to pull tomorrow, and a copy of, or a link to the YouTube video that we'll be posting, as well as some resources that Jen had mentioned, like the MEMA site and things like that, the kits. So thank you all for being here and spending your time with us. And I hope you all stay safe, and let us know if you have any additional questions. You can always contact me at the library. Have a wonderful night. Bye, everybody.